Progressing in our offseason preview series, why the Washington Commanders could get Myles Garrett on loan and how that could spark some serious growth in the pass rush department. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome inside today, everybody, to this episode of Locked On Commanders. I'm your host, David Harrison, covering the Washington Commanders for you for Sports Illustrated's CommanderGameDay.com, also part of WUSA9.com's local coverage of the team. I'm here with you every Monday through Friday, and I want to thank you for coming through today for this episode. Today, we are going to be talking about the edge group for the Washington Commanders, doing our 2025 offseason preview, talking about guys like Khalil Mack, Josh Sweat, Myles Garrett, and of course, the players that are already on contract and could be brought back under contract. So thank you for coming through today. Everydayers, those of you who come through every day, I want to thank you for being an extra special part of this program. If you're not already, please subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you are listening to this episode right now. And of course, if you're new to the show, I want to thank you for giving it a try. Glad that you found us. Hopefully you like it. Hopefully you come back for more. This is your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And we are here 5 days a week throughout the offseason and, of course, in the regular season. But before we get to the regular season, we got to talk about what the Washington Commanders are going to do this episode, specifically about the edge group. And I'm going to tell you why the Browns and Commanders share a mutual drive for Myles Garrett to be traded, not for a 2025 first-round pick, but for a 2026 first-round pick and whatever comes afterwards. But before we get to that part of the discussion, we've got to set the table with the Commanders edge group in 2025, specifically talking about who is under contract already, who is not under contract that could be or should be brought back. And we're going to start off with the guys that are currently under contract. So edge group, we're talking defensive ends, we're talking outside linebackers. Dorance Armstrong Jr., defensive end, under contract for 2025. Frankie Luvu, outside linebacker, under contract for 2025. Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Viliami Fehoko Jr., Andre Jones Jr., also under contract for 2025. That leaves one outside linebacker under contract. That's Frankie Luvu. Two starters, Luvu and Armstrong Jr., three depth/practice squad candidates as far as I see them right now. Javonte Jean-Baptiste certainly showing some flashes, certainly showing some potential in his opportunities in the 2024 NFL season. Viliami Fehoko really didn't get a lot of burn during the 2024 season. Of course, Andre Jones Jr., one of the few Ron Rivera holdovers still remaining on the roster. I still think there's there's potential in Andre Jones Jr., not necessarily to be a every down, a year in, year out starter, but certainly a contributor on the team. Looking at the guys who have expiring contracts this offseason, Dante Fowler Jr., outside linebacker for the Washington Commanders. Also, Michael Walker, an outside linebacker for the Commanders. We'll talk about them a little bit more in depth here in a second. But defensive end-wise, Clelin Ferrell, Jalen Holmes, the two DNs that have expiring contracts, 531 defensive snaps combined between those two in 2024, 40 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 11 quarterback hits, 5.5 sacks. Now, of course, the majority of those stats came from Clelin Ferrell. He was the starter. He played more reps. But the thing is, Jalen Holmes had more tackles for loss. He had similar sack numbers and similar quarterback hit numbers, but played 350 snaps fewer than Clelin Ferrell did in 2024. So for me, we know who Clelin Ferrell is at this point. Truthfully, the impact he was supposed to make the most was as a run defender, gap filler, edge setter, helping stop the run. It didn't really materialize that way. So as he moves on to find another opportunity at this offseason, I think Washington needs to let him and do the same for their own defensive end position, at least opposite of Dorance Armstrong there as the other defensive end. But I'm all for bringing back Jalen Holmes. I want to allow him to battle out with Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Viliami Fehoko, Andre Jones Jr. for snaps in 2025. And considering the fact that the only defensive end that out-snapped Jalen Holmes for the Commanders in 2024 was Javonte Jean-Baptiste, despite the fact that Holmes didn't even join the Commanders until October, I think it's a pretty good chance that if Jalen Holmes comes back, if the Commanders bring him back, that he not only carves out a role, but is that third defensive end in the rotation behind whoever the two starters end up being. Even the PFF grades between Holmes and Ferrell are very close. So for my money, if you're talking about paying Clelin Ferrell to come back again or paying Jalen Holmes to come back again, I'm letting Ferrell hit free agency and I'm bringing back Jalen Holmes and then hitting free agency, the NFL draft, or the trade market to find a starter, because I don't think Jalen Holmes is necessarily a plug-and-play starter, coming into 2025. So I'm still looking in the free agency market, the NFL draft, or the trade market to find another starter opposite of Dorance Armstrong Jr. there on the defensive line. Now, as for the outside linebackers, I'm all for bringing back Dante Fowler Jr. and even Michael Walker, who I think is a really valuable depth linebacker who can play outside, can play inside, can play special teams, do a lot of things for you. So no reason not to bring Michael Walker back. I do like the idea of bringing back Dante Fowler Jr., but we're going to talk a little bit later about why that may not actually be in the cards for the Washington Commanders. So that would give you a 2025 edge roster of Dorance Armstrong Jr., Frankie Luvu, Dante Fowler Jr., Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Jalen Holmes, Michael Walker, Andre Jones Jr., Viliami Fehoko Jr., all before we get to add new players. So actually a fairly fleshed out group as far as the amount of players. But what you're missing, if you notice, is you're missing that top end D-line defensive end presence. They could get that by trading for a guy like Myles Garrett. Now, we've talked a lot this offseason already about the potential for the Washington Commanders trading for Myles Garrett, the production, the lineage. Yes, he's a little bit older. Yes, he's going to be a little bit expensive. I mean, coming in, he's going to be coming in on a $4 million cap hit if you trade for him right now, which is very low, but he's going to want a new contract. That new contract's going to inflate some of those numbers a little bit, potentially right up front, potentially later in the deal, depending on how Adam Peters, Lance Newmark, that entire staff, and Myles Garrett's agent works that all out. But the bottom line is you bring in a guy like Myles Garrett, and it immediately upgrades your entire defensive front, your entire pass rush ability, and your entire ability to stop the run, which, of course, as we remember, was the biggest hindrance to the Washington Commanders defense in 2024. However, a little bit of conspiracy theory on my part, but there is a reality here, I believe, where the Washington Commanders get Myles Garrett in 2025, but they get him without having to pay for him until 2026. We're going to dive deep into that rabbit hole coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you in part by TurboTax. This message is from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes used to be waiting and wondering and worrying if you were ever going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with TurboTax experts who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. So get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Talking about the Washington Commanders edge group heading into the 2025 offseason, we kind of set the table for who's already under contract, who may be coming back under new contracts that have currently expiring deals. Now it's time to talk about adding new talent to the 2025 edge group. And just like we do with the receivers, I'm going to give you a couple of options that I'm on board with, a couple of options I don't know that I see completely working, giving context. But before we get to all that, we got to talk more about Myles Garrett. And that gets back to what I said in the beginning of the episode. Some are going to say, I've got my head in the clouds, and that's perfectly fine. I'm willing to admit that there's a reality here where this isn't actually the way that things are going to work out. But there is a reason, as far as I see it, for both Washington and Cleveland to not involve 2025 draft capital in a trade this offseason that involves Myles Garrett. For the Commanders, it's very obvious. You get Myles Garrett now, you pay for him later, at least in the sense of giving the Browns draft capital. You're going to pay Myles Garrett, obviously, up front. But obviously, the benefit there for the Washington Commanders is clear. You get to keep your 2025 first-round draft pick, number 29 overall. Use it as you see fit if you're Adam Peters. And then you don't really pay in the sense of trade capital for Myles Garrett until 2026. So now here's the tricky part. Why would the Cleveland Browns defer payment for Myles Garrett until 2026? Well, there's a reality here where it's not even necessarily a preference thing. It's a determination thing, right? So there's a possibility that the Browns just put themselves in a position to not trade Myles Garrett for 2025 draft capital simply based off of what they've already said. So Myles Garrett has come out, said he wants to be traded. He wants to go win a championship. He doesn't see that happening in Cleveland. He's not interested in going from Cleveland to Canton without a ring. He wants a ring. The Browns have said, we're not going to trade him. In fact, we're not even going to receive phone calls to trade for him. We're not even going to talk about the idea of trading for him. Now, the NFL scouting combine is coming up next week. GMs and coaches typically take the podium and do press interviews. Myles Garrett is definitely going to come up when the Browns come up. So we'll see what they say at the NFL scouting combine. But if we leave the NFL scouting combine, because that's where a lot of these conversations happen, that's where a lot of these conversations start. If we leave the NFL scouting combine and guys like Ian Rappaport, guys like Tom Pelissero, Mike Garafolo, Jeremy Fowler, if these guys are not leading the NFL scouting combine saying the Cleveland Browns did start having talks with teams about potential trade packages for Myles Garrett, still want to keep him, still say they're not trading him, but they're doing their due diligence, blah, 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 blah. If we leave the NFL scouting combine and the story is still the Browns are not having conversations about trading Myles Garrett, then that lends the possibility that they will not trade him before the NFL draft. If they don't trade him before the NFL draft, you're talking about a draft day trade, which we'll get here to in a minute, or you're talking about keeping Myles Garrett past the NFL draft, in which case you obviously can't trade for 2025 draft capital anymore. So now you're having to draft for 2026 draft capital. So there's just a situation where the way this thing plays out leads to the Browns not getting 2025 draft capital, right? If the stalemate is truly on and Garrett is serious about getting traded, then Cleveland is eventually going to have to trade him. But it likely won't happen until after the NFL draft. So, of course, Peters can't draft based on that alone, right? You can't go into and say, well, I think that Myles Garrett will get traded in August. I think he'll get traded in June, whatever it is. So I'm going to go ahead and draft based off of that assumption. But what you can do is you can go ahead and pursue some other things you need in the meantime. But the fact remains, like I said, there is a scenario here where the Browns dig their heels in so deep that they end up relenting after the NFL draft at Washington and then give up a 2026 first rounder instead of a 2025. And perhaps you'll give up less draft capital in total because by the time that happens, Garrett needs more time to get up to speed with the defense. They're losing part of their offseason program to get him ingrained. All these other things, the Browns are going to save a little bit of money on dead cap space if they don't trade him until after June 1st. So, there's some things here that kind of impact the compensatory evaluations when you wait if you're the Cleveland Browns. Now, the hidden benefit for doing so for Cleveland, honestly, lies in the NFL draft class. And this is where I think the Cleveland Browns actually could be better served waiting until after the NFL draft to trade Myles Garrett. There's no slam dunk franchise quarterbacks in this year's class. In fact, depending on who you talk to, there's some people who say guys like Shadir Sanders are day two quarterbacks. And then there's some who have him mock drafted in the top 5. So the evaluation on his quarterback class right now is so widespread. It's so thin. It's so spread out that there's really no guarantees. Now, on top of that, like it or not, if you're Cleveland, you still have Deshaun Watson under contract. He counts for $72.9 million against the salary cap this year with a dead cap figure of $172.7 million. That cap hit is the same in 2026, but the dead cap in 2026 is $99.8 million. It's a terrible contract, no matter how you slice it, just like we all said it was when they happened in the first place. But it's not as terrible to cut or move on from Deshaun Watson next year as it is this year. Now, with those two factors, weak quarterback class this year, Deshaun Watson situation in Cleveland, my belief is the Browns would be much better off selling the number 2 overall pick this year, which they have in the 2025 NFL draft, to say the New York Giants, who may be interested in taking a quarterback that early because, let's be honest, Brian Daboll kind of have to figure out that quarterback position or else you're not going to have a job. So Brian Daboll, Joe Shane, they move up with the Cleveland Browns number 2. You sell that number 2 pick for the number 3 pick and some draft capital in the future. Don't take any 2025 picks from the Giants if you're the Browns. No, you want 2026 draft capital. Now you're going to take the swap, so you keep an early first-round pick this year, but say number 2 for number 3, and then if you're looking at the Rich Hill model for draft pick trade value compensation, you're actually talking about maybe the Browns throw in a mid-round pick, and then the Giants have to give up their 2026 first as well. So now if you're the Browns, you've got your 2026 first-rounder, you've got the Giants' 2026 first-rounder, and you move back 1 spot. Now if you end up trading Myles Garrett to the Commanders for a 2026 first-rounder, you've got 3 first-round picks. One of those is likely to be later. 2 of those are likely to be earlier, but it's a better quarterback class for you. And now you've got the capital that if you need to package some picks to move up, depending on what happens with your season, you have that flexibility. Now, if the Giants don't want to pay the ransom, well, then you can look to flip number 2 to say the Las Vegas Raiders at number 6 for a straight up 1-in-1 deal, right? You give up number 2, they give up number 6 and their first round pick next year, and you still have 2 first rounders going into a scenario where you might trade Myles Garrett for another first rounder. Now, the best case scenario here for Cleveland is you get the number 3 overall pick from the Giants. The Giants draft a quarterback after the Titans at number 1 somehow don't draft Abdul Carter out of Penn State. The Browns get Abdul Carter at number 3, a new edge rusher to build around. Eventually, you have 3 number 1s in 2026, and your situation, your future looks a little bit better, even though as a Browns fan and as the Browns, you're still going to have to buckle up for a pretty rough 2025. After all that saying, Washington has Myles Garrett, potentially keeps their 2025 first-round pick, and everybody walks away happy. Of course, Cleveland Browns get Abdul Carter. Now they've got less of a reason to cling to Myles Garrett, so they may open up the phone line and say, hey, we're going to go ahead and start having talks for Myles Garrett now. The good news there is the teams that are kind of right after you don't really have the time to formulate negotiations and do all that stuff. So the teams that are later in the day have that a little bit. And look, they still may not even look for a 2025 first. They may say, look, we have Abdul Carter. We're open to trading Myles Garrett, but the opening cost is 2026 first rounder. We'll go from there. And we're not looking to make this, happen. It's one of those things that between the end of round 1, between the beginning of round 2, ends up getting executed. There's a lot of different ways this thing can go on. But of course, there is also the possibility the Browns say we got Abdul Carter. We're trading Myles Garrett, but we're doing it for a 2025 first. So if your pick comes and goes, you're out of the bidding. And now the Washington Commanders have to give up that 2025 first because, of course, no plan is foolproof, not even the ones that I make up on my own and get to choose on my own show if they would work or not. But like we said, Peters can't bank on trading for Myles Garrett until the Cleveland Browns are at least willing to come to the table, right? So even after or before the NFL draft, whatever it is, Adam Peters owes it to himself, owes it to his team to go out there and find the best defensive ends, outside linebackers that he can find for this team moving forward. That is where we're going to turn our focus next on our Edge offseason preview here on Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you in part by FanDuel. When the games tip off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on the fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay easily. My favorite thing about FanDuel same game parlays. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting, whether I'm backing my favorite team or looking for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3. I never feel like I'm missing any of the action. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you can get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Wrapping up today's offseason preview episode, focusing on edge rushers for the Washington Commanders. Now we're going to turn our attention to some players that are out there available that could or could not necessarily fit, but are being talked about as potential fits for the Washington Commanders. We're going to start it all off with Khalil Mack. If there's a guy who gets talked about more after Myles Garrett, as far as the Washington edge situation goes, it's Khalil Mack. To me, Khalil Mack, more of an outside linebacker than a down lineman, but he does do both, can do both, has done both for the Los Angeles Chargers as early as last year. Does give Joey Jr. a little bit more scheme flexibility. The question is Mack enough of a down lineman for Witt to justify bringing back Dante Fowler? Because Dante Fowler is your outside linebacker. Again, will put his hand in the dirt every once in a while as well. But if Khalil Mack is more outside linebacker than D-end in Joe Witt Jr.'s system, then Dante Fowler kind of becomes a little bit obsolete there. And if you do trade for Garrett, that basically pushes Mack out to outside linebacker permanently, and Fowler essentially gets pushed off the radar. So it doesn't make sense to bring Fowler back and Khalil Mack in that situation. So for me, the question here is Khalil Mack or Dante Fowler. I don't personally see Fowler as the long-term answer for outside linebacker / D-end hybrid edge defender. So if we're going short-term, then I'm probably targeting Khalil Mack. His market value is much higher, right? $23.6 million projected per year by Spot Track on a 3-year deal. Fowler is projected at $5.2 million per year on a 3-year deal, but I think he probably thinks he's worth a little bit more than that, right? Another Dante Fowler replacement candidate would be Josh Sweat. His market value projected by Spot Track is at $18.8 million per year on a 3-year deal. somewhat between Mack and Fowler. And it's important to remember, guys, that we talk about $18.8 million per year on average. It's not necessarily meaning $18.8 million this year, next year, and the year after. There's a lot of different ways these guys can work out these contracts, including void years. I mean, that $18.8 million per year for a 3-year deal could actually get spread out for another 2 years after the 3 years there. So, again, just don't get too wrapped up around the numbers unless it's outside of really just looking at a gauge of just how much each player is going to cost respectively. So 8 sacks in 2024 for Josh Sweat with the Philadelphia Eagles, 6.5 in 2023, 11 in 2022. Has never really been able to be kind of the primary guy there in Philly. So potentially going to be looking to leave to go find a place where he can be one of those primary guys. Again, Josh Sweat is another guy who plays with his hand in the dirt, plays standing up for the Washington Commanders. How much do you need that kind of a guy? You're obviously, to me, not bringing Fowler and Sweat in, I don't believe. Still allows you to go after Myles Garrett again because Garrett is almost exclusively a down lineman, while Sweat and Mack, again, both play standing up as well as playing down. The thing about Sweat and Mack standing up, however, is that Washington doesn't really use a lot of second outside linebackers in 2024. At least they didn't, right? It isn't really in the history of Dan Quinn and Joe Jr. all that much. So spending premium money on another outside linebacker is something that doesn't necessarily sit well with me unless we're talking about Joe Witt Jr. and Dan Quinn changing up their defensive scheme. So, for example, Frankie Luvu and Dante Fowler are your two primary outside linebackers 2024. Luvu played 1,059 snaps. Dante Fowler played just 564. So if you're bringing in Khalil Mack or Josh Sweat, you're not going to pay them that money and bring them in to play 564 snaps, right? So they're going to be a true D-end outside linebacker hybrid type of player, which is fine. But if you are then still looking to potentially trade for Myles Garrett is a straight up down lineman. So now you're back in a situation where you have this third linebacker. You got hopefully Bobby Wagner returning inside, Frankie Luvu on the outside. Now you've got either Khalil Mack or Josh Sweat. And you're talking about reducing someone's workload, and you're not going to pay that much for a reduced workload, I don't believe. So you would then be talking about wholesale changes to the scheme, or the other alternative is, Dorance Armstrong now gets some snaps taken away by the presence of Khalil Mack or Josh Sweat, who play down lineman, but then also play standing up every once in a while. So you start to kind of risk getting into a place where your room gets a little convoluted, and your scheme actually becomes a little bit unstable because you're trying to figure out the right combination. So I don't know that we should be looking for Peters to really take a big swing at those edge defenders that could split time as down linemen or outside linebackers, unless it's clear that he's not going for Myles Garrett. So if you get either Khalil Mack or you get Josh Sweat, I believe it lessens the likelihood that the Washington Commanders go after or at least obtain Myles Garrett. Now, the highest graded edge that is a defensive end, more than either an outside linebacker or split duty guy, would be Malcolm Koonce from the Las Vegas Raiders. So if Myles Garrett is just not a possibility, and let's say they bring in Khalil Mack or they bring in Josh Sweat or they bring back Dante Fowler, but you go looking for another edge to try to upgrade over Cleveland Farrell, Malcolm Koonce is potentially a candidate here. Turns 27 in June. Was third-round pick of the Raiders in 2021 out of Buffalo. Had 8 sacks in 2023. His only year really starting for the Raiders. Was expected to be a really big part of their defense 2024, but he suffered a major knee injury 3 days before the season opener. Did not play in 2024. Now, he does appear to be a better run defender than Farrell. Certainly has more pass rush juice. His market value is expected to be in the $20 million range per year on a 2-year deal. But that feels a bit rich for a guy who has 1 year of proven production and is coming off of a serious knee injury. So either takes him off the boards for me and for Adam Peters, or it likely results at least in an incentive-heavy contract to where Koonce would have to come in and really produce in order to get all the money that the contract is reported. And the next name there for me would be Dayo Odeyingbo from the Indianapolis Colts. He turns 26 in September. Second-round pick by the Colts in 2021. 3 sacks this year, 8 in 2023. 7 tackles for loss or no gain in 2024. His market value is projected at $16 million per year on a 4-year deal. So somewhat of a similar situation. Look, if I had it my way, if the Browns are saying they're not budging and we get to the new league year, I'm probably targeting Khalil Mack, hoping he's going to come in under market value for a chance to win. And if I get Garrett later, I'm going to enjoy solving the problem of having Garrett and Mack on the field along with Frankie Luvu. Again, probably means Mack and Armstrong do a little bit of a rotation thing, keep Mack as fresh as you possibly can moving down. And then Dorance Armstrong, clearly not the defensive end or edge that Myles Garrett is. So it's not an easy equation really in this group as much as it is in some other groups. But that's the reason Adam Peters, Lance Newmark, and those guys all get paid to do the jobs that they get paid to do. And they do a pretty good job of it, at least in 1 year's sample size. So that is our outside linebacker, defensive end, edge offseason prediction, or as I say, projection, preview for the 2025 offseason. Again, one of the most important position groups for the Commanders to solve this season, but not necessarily the easiest because of the different skill sets all these guys potentially bring, how they fit into the scheme, what it can mean for the future, all of those things. But a lot of information here in this episode. We will continue to do this offensive line coming up in our next offseason preview episode. So make sure you come back for that. In the meantime, if you got questions or comments, all you got to do is text me. To do that, all you got to do is become a Locked On Commanders insider by going to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. For your next listen, check out the Locked On NFL podcast. Tyler Rowland is going to kick you off in the morning with some NFL espresso. Tony Wiggins is going to bring you back in the afternoon for some real NFL talk. It's the all-new Locked On NFL, and it's twice per day. As always, I want to thank you for coming here and making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. I want to thank you for coming through on a regular basis like you do. And until we speak again, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you right back here next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.